At 4 a.m., on a freezing November night in Boston, Caspian Voss, the man half the city feared and the other half pretended didn't exist, walked into a locked room inside his penthouse and found a stranger kneeling on his floor with his dying black mamba coiled around her bare arm. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't shaking. She was whispering to it, one hand cradling the snake's head like it was a sleeping child, the other dripping saline into its mouth with a dropper she'd found, God knows where. The snake, Obsidian, the only living thing Caspian had loved since burying his wife 3 years ago, had been dying for 2 days, and not a single person in his organization had the guts or the knowledge to touch it. But this woman did. This broke, starving, 27-year-old widow who'd shown up at his door 6 hours earlier with a feverish 5-year-old son asleep on her shoulder and $47 to her name, begging for any work he'd give her so her boy could eat tomorrow. He'd let her in for reasons he still didn't understand. He'd told his housekeeper to feed her and give her a room. Then he'd walked away and tried to forget she existed. But here she was, at dawn, saving the one thing in his world that still carried his dead wife's fingerprints, and she didn't even know what it meant to him. She just saw something suffering and couldn't walk past it. Caspian Voss had built an empire on knowing exactly what people wanted from him. Money, power, protection, fear. But kneeling on that cold floor, her dark hair falling across a face too thin from weeks of hunger, Wren Calloway wasn't asking for any of those things. She was just trying to keep a dying creature alive because that's who she was, the kind of person who saved things, even when nobody was watching, even when the thing she was saving could kill her with a single bite. And standing in that doorway, watching a woman hold death in her hands without flinching, Caspian felt something crack open inside his chest that he'd spent 3 years sealing shut. He didn't know it yet, but the woman on his floor was about to dismantle everything. His walls, his rules, his empire, and the careful lie he'd been telling himself that he was better off alone. What happened between them over the next few months would shake the Boston underworld to its foundation, expose a betrayal worth millions hidden inside his own organization, and force both of them to answer a question. Neither was ready for what happens when the most dangerous man in the city falls for the one person brave enough to see him as human. If that story sounds like something you don't want to miss, hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs a good story tonight. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to 6 hours earlier, where it all started a rainy night in Southie, where Wren Calloway had just run out of places to hide. That night, Boston wasn't just raining. It was pouring down as if the sky itself were punishing anyone who dared to stand beneath it. Wren Calloway pressed her back against the icy brick wall beneath the awning of a closed liquor store on the corner of West Broadway in Southie, trying to keep Milo from slipping off her shoulder. The boy was 5 years old, heavier than she remembered, or maybe her arms were weaker than she wanted to admit. Milo had a fever, his warm forehead resting against her neck, his breathing shallow and quick. But at least he was asleep, and sleep was the only thing Wren could still give her son right now. The smell of wet garbage rose from the alley beside her, mixing with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt, and from somewhere down the street came the dull, heavy bass from a bar that was still open, steady as the heartbeat of a city that never slept and never cared who was slowly dying at its edges. 6 weeks earlier, Wren still had an apartment, an old car, a husband, and the belief that even when life was hard, there was still some kind of ground beneath her feet. Then, Scott died. Not from illness, not from an accident, but because of the $80,000 he owed Pike Grogan, the most notorious loan shark in Dorchester. Scott had hidden the gambling from her for 2 years, hidden the loans stacked on top of loans, hidden the midnight calls where threats came through the phone like cold breath, until the police knocked on her door at 4 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday and told her they had found her husband in the alley behind a laundromat on Dorchester Avenue. The report said, "Assault by an unknown subject." No one was arrested. No one ever would be. 1 week after the funeral, Pike came. Wren remembered it clearly because she had put Milo to bed exactly 10 minutes earlier, had carefully closed her son's bedroom door, and only then had opened the front door. Pike Grogan was 45 years old, with a face like worn leather and eyes with no bottom, standing in front of her apartment with both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat as if he were simply dropping by to visit a neighbor. "Your husband owed me $80,000, he said, his voice calm enough to be terrifying. "You have 30 days. Wren said she didn't have the money, didn't know anything about the debt, and had nothing to do with it. Pike only smiled, the kind of smile that needed no further explanation, and then he walked away. 10 days later, he came back and took her car. 20 days later, he took the apartment, throwing her out with exactly one backpack and her little boy. Today was the 28th day. 2 days left. Wren didn't know what Pike would do in 2 days, and she didn't allow herself to think about it. Over the past 4 weeks, she had knocked on every door a desperate mother could knock on. The restaurants in Seaport turned her down because she had no one to watch her child during the evening shift. Her only cousin in Quincy shut the door in her face because her husband said plainly, "I don't want trouble with Pike Grogan under my roof." The women's shelter at Pine Street Inn was full. The waiting list was 3 weeks long, and the intake worker looked at Wren with pity in her eyes but couldn't offer anything except a sheet of paper with a hotline number written on it. Wren stuffed the paper into her pocket and stepped back into the rain. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her last meal had been half a sandwich she got from the charity food table at St. Monica's Church on Thursday afternoon the week before, and she had given Milo the larger portion while telling him she wasn't hungry. Her stomach had stopped growling yesterday, shifting into a kind of numbness she knew was a bad sign. But Milo had still eaten. Every day, she found a way to get him at least one meal, even if she had to stand in line for 2 hours at a church, even if she had to pick up forgotten packets of crackers left behind on a park bench. The boy still ate, and that was the only thing keeping Wren from collapsing. Milo shivered in his sleep, and Wren held him tighter, feeling the heat of his body through 2 layers of wet clothing. He hadn't said a single word since the night the police knocked on the door and told her Scott was dead. 6 weeks of silence. The doctor at the community clinic called it selective mutism. Said the boy needed stability, needed a sense of safety, needed a place to call home. Wren wanted to scream in the doctor's face that she knew what her child needed. She just had nothing to give him. The rain kept falling, and Wren stood there holding her son in the darkness of Southie, looking down the empty street, thinking this might be the last night she could still keep Milo with her before everything collapsed completely. Then she saw light spilling from a dirty window at the end of the block, where a red neon sign blinked with the words, "The Rusted Nail," and she started walking toward it, not because of hope, but because there was light inside, and light meant warmth, and warmth was the only thing she could give Milo tonight. The Rusted Nail looked like a place people came to forget, not to find anything, and maybe that was why it was still open at 1 o'clock in the morning when everything else on this street had long since turned off its lights. Wren pushed the wooden door open with her shoulder because both her hands were holding Milo, and the warmth inside struck her face like a gentle slap. The bar was small, with a low ceiling, murky yellow light. The smell of old beer soaked into the walls and into the wooden floor, which was so chipped and worn that its original color could no longer be recognized. There were only 2 customers sitting in the far corner, their faces lowered toward their glasses as if the rest of the world didn't exist, and one man stood behind the bar wiping a glass with a towel that needed washing itself. Ray Whitfield was 58 years old, with close, cropped salt and pepper hair, a face lined with wrinkles stacked over one another like the map of a life that hadn't been easy, and eyes so sharp they saw everything before you had time to hide it. He watched Wren walk in, watched the feverish child asleep against her shoulder, watched the soaked backpack on her back, watched the torn toes of her shoes, and didn't say a word. He only set a glass of warm water and a plate of bread on the counter, then turned back to wiping glasses. Wren wanted to say she didn't need charity, wanted to say she had only come in because she needed a warm place for her son for 10 minutes, and then she would leave. But Milo stirred on her shoulder, and his eyes opened a little, looking at the plate of bread, and Wren couldn't say no. She sat down on the tall stool in front of the counter, settled Milo on her lap, and tore off a piece of bread to give him. The boy ate slowly, his eyes dull with fever, still saying nothing, but his small fingers held the bread tightly, as if he were afraid it might disappear. Wren didn't eat. She took a sip of warm water and felt it run down into her empty stomach, so hot it almost hurt. Ray finished wiping the last glass, set it down, and looked at her with eyes that didn't judge, didn't pity, only read. "You're running from someone," he said, not as a question. Wren meant to deny it, but she was too tired to lie. "I'm not running. I'm out of places to go." "Sounds the same." Ray poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "What do you need? Money? A place to sleep?" "Work," Wren said, and heard how hoarse her own voice had become from barely using it over the past few days. "Any kind of work. I don't have work to give. This place is lucky if it makes enough to pay the electric bill." Ray paused, looked at Milo, who had fallen asleep again on Ren's lap, then looked back at her. "What can you do?" "Accounting. I graduated from Suffolk University. Worked 3 years for a company in the financial district before—" She stopped, swallowing the rest of the sentence. "Before everything changed. I know how to read books, balance finances, find discrepancies in reports." Ray looked at her longer than normal, and something shifted in his eyes, as if she had just spoken a key word that opened a door he hadn't expected to still have the key for. "Accounting," he repeated slowly. Then he stayed silent for nearly a full minute, wiping the bar with that old towel as if he were thinking through every circle of his hand. Ren didn't ask anything else. She had grown too used to people going quiet right before they refused her. But Ray didn't refuse. 25 years ago, I drove for a man named Garrett Voss, he said, his voice lowering even though no one in the bar was listening. He ran half this city from the side no one ever saw. He died 10 years ago, and his son inherited everything. Ray stopped. His son's name is Caspian Voss. Ren didn't recognize the name, but she recognized the way Ray said it, carefully, as if the name had physical weight. "Caspian Voss is the most dangerous man you'll ever meet in your life," Ray said plainly, without dressing it up. "He lost his wife 3 years ago, and since then he's been colder than winter here. He doesn't let anyone close, doesn't trust anyone. He's thrown dozens of people out over the past year just because they looked at him the wrong way." Ray poured more water into Ren's glass even though she hadn't finished it. "But he's fair. I drove for his father long enough to know that family pays its debts clean, and he always needs someone who can handle numbers, because money is the blood of everything he's built." "Why are you telling me this?" Ren asked. "Because you're sitting here at 1 o'clock in the morning with a feverish child and a plate of bread you're giving entirely to him," Ray said. "And because I've seen enough people die at the edges of this city to know that by morning, you won't have any choices left." He looked straight into her eyes. "But listen to me. When you stand in front of him, don't tell him your sad story. Don't cry. Don't beg for pity. He hates that more than he hates his enemies. Just tell him what you can do and let him decide for himself." Ray flipped over a cardboard coaster, pulled a pen from his shirt pocket, and wrote an address on the back. "Obsidian Tower, Back Bay, 42nd floor." He pushed the coaster toward Ren. "Go tonight. The buses have stopped running, so you'll have to walk. From here to Back Bay is about 45 minutes if you move fast." Ren looked at the handwritten words on the coaster and felt something she had thought she'd lost forever suddenly stir at the bottom of her chest. Tiny, fragile, almost too small to matter, but real. "You're stepping into a world unlike anywhere you've ever known," Ray said as Ren stood up and lifted Milo onto her shoulder. "Once you're in, it isn't easy to get out. You understand?" "I understand," Ren said, though she didn't truly understand. Couldn't understand yet. But she understood one thing simpler than every warning. If she didn't go tonight, then by morning she would lose Milo, and no world, no matter how dangerous, could be more terrifying than that. She tucked the coaster into her coat pocket, nodded her thanks to Ray, and stepped back out into the rain. 45 minutes walking through the November rain in Boston was enough for Ren to forget what her toes were supposed to feel like. She walked along Broadway, then cut through Fort Point, crossing dark streets where the streetlights flickered weakly over the wet pavement, and with every step, she felt Milo's weight grow a little heavier on her right shoulder. The boy was still asleep, his hot breath brushing her neck, his forehead still burning. And Ren kept walking, because stopping now meant sitting down, and sitting down meant she might never be able to stand back up again. When she turned into Back Bay, the world changed within the span of a single block. The sidewalks were polished clean, the trees neatly trimmed, the rows of reddish brownstone buildings standing in perfect order like a quiet reminder that she didn't belong here, and never had. Then she saw it. Obsidian Tower stood at the end of Boylston Street, like a black sword driven straight into the night sky. 50 floors of dark glass reflecting the lights of the city, and Ren stopped for one breath because the building didn't look like a place where people lived. It looked like a place where people ruled. She pushed the revolving door with her shoulder and stepped into the lobby. Black marble beneath her feet, a ceiling 3 times higher than her old apartment. Soft golden light falling from chandeliers, she guessed each cost more than a full year of her old salary. It was so quiet she could hear water dripping from her coat onto the stone floor. The guard sitting behind the reception desk looked at her as if he were looking at a stain on a painting. He was tall, dressed in a gray suit, and his eyes moved from her torn shoes to the soaked backpack, to the sleeping child on her shoulder. then stopped on her face with an expression Wren had grown far too familiar with over the past 4 weeks. "I need to see someone on the 42nd floor," Wren said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ray Whitfield sent me." That name changed everything. Not much, but enough. The guard looked at her for 3 more seconds, then picked up the phone, dialed a number, and said a few words she couldn't hear clearly. 5 minutes of silence. Wren stood in the middle of the marble lobby, rainwater running from her coat and forming a small puddle around her feet, trying not to think about the possibility that this door would slam shut in her face too, like every other door had. "Private elevator on the right," the guard said, without looking at her. 42nd floor. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, and Wren stepped into a world she hadn't known existed outside of movies. Ceilings 5 meters high, walls of glass from floor to ceiling looking out over the entire Boston skyline at night. The city lights spread beneath her like a glowing carpet. The furniture was minimal, but every piece gave off the silent luxury that only truly serious money could buy. Not flashy, just expensive. And quiet. The unnatural kind of quiet, the kind created by a space too large for one person, as if the entire penthouse were holding its breath. It smelled of oak, whiskey, and something colder that Wren couldn't name. She stood there, water dripping from her coat onto the dark wooden floor, and felt so small she almost didn't exist. "Ray sent you." The voice came from the left, where the shadows were thicker beside the glass wall, and Wren startled because she hadn't seen anyone there until he moved. Caspian Voss stepped out of the darkness as if the darkness belonged to him, not the other way around. 36 years old, nearly a head taller than her, broad-shouldered, black-haired, with pale gray eyes as cold as metal beneath the dim light. A black suit with no tie, the collar of his shirt slightly open, his right hand holding a glass of whiskey he had barely touched. His face was beautiful, but not in a way that made people want to come closer. Beautiful like a blade sharpened too finely, compelling to look at, but bloody if touched. He didn't look at Wren. He read her, from head to toe, the same way someone reads a contract looking for a hidden clause. "Yes," Wren said. "He said you might have work for me. Ray says many things. Not all of them are true." Caspian took a sip of whiskey, his eyes still fixed on her. "What do you want?" "Work. I'm an accountant, Suffolk graduate, 3 years of experience in the financial district. I know how to read books, balance finances, trace gaps in a system. If there's $1 hidden inside your accounting system, I can find it within 72 hours. "Too confident," Caspian said, his voice completely flat. "If I'm lying, then 72 hours from now you'll know, and I'll leave on my own." "No." One word, cold and final. He started to turn away, and Wren felt the floor beneath her feet cave in because the last door on earth was closing, and behind her there was nothing left but the dark night and Pike Grogan and 2 more days. "Please," she said, and hated herself for that word, hated Ray for telling her not to beg, but she couldn't help saying it because Milo was burning with fever on her shoulder, and she had nowhere left to go. Caspian stopped, not because of the plea. Wren could see that clearly, but because Milo stirred against her shoulder. The boy shifted, lifted his head, opened his fever, dull eyes halfway, and looked straight at Caspian, not afraid, not crying, just looking. Large, dark eyes, clouded by fever but still steady. The kind of gaze children have when they don't yet know how to judge, don't yet know how to fear, and are only trying to understand the world in front of them. And something flashed across Caspian's face. So fast Wren almost missed it, like lightning far off on the horizon that you aren't sure you truly saw. Then it vanished, and his face returned to its old coldness. "Margot," Caspian called out without turning his head, his voice echoing through the empty space of the penthouse. A woman appeared from the hallway behind him, quick and silent, as if she had been standing there waiting all along. 62 years old, silver hair pinned tightly at the back of her neck, spine straight as a ruler, her face showing nothing except the absolute calm that only comes after decades spent living in a world that doesn't permit weakness. "Feed them," Caspian said, his eyes still on the darkness ahead instead of on Wren. "Last room at the end of the hall downstairs. Don't ask." Then he walked away, melting into the shadows at the far end of the penthouse, and disappeared without another word, the whiskey glass still in his hand, as if the conversation that had just taken place had never happened at all. Margot watched him go, then turned back and looked Wren over from head to toe, looked at the feverish child on her shoulder, looked at the puddle of rainwater around her feet, and for the first time, an expression flickered across her face. Not pity, something closer to quiet astonishment. "Strange," Margot said, her voice so soft it was almost meant only for herself. The first time in 3 years, Margot led Wren down to the lower level of the penthouse, by way of a dark wooden staircase, along a long hallway, with a ceiling lower than the one upstairs, though still wider than any place Wren had ever called home. The room at the end of the hall was small but clean, with a single bed made with white sheets, a wooden dresser, a large window looking out over the Boston skyline at night, and a soft silence completely different from the cold silence upstairs. Margot disappeared and came back in less than 5 minutes, with a tray of food, 2 steaming bowls of hot noodles, and 2 glasses of orange juice. She set the tray on the table beside the bed without saying anything, but her eyes stopped on Milo as Wren laid the boy down. Milo smelled the food and opened his eyes, still not speaking. But when Wren placed the bowl of noodles in front of him, he picked up the chopsticks and ate hungrily with the raw instinct of a child who had been hungry for too long. Wren ate more slowly, not because she could control herself, but because her body had gone too long without food, and her stomach cramped with every swallow. It hurt, but she kept eating because she needed to live, at least until morning. Margot sat down in the chair beside the door and watched them eat with an expression Wren couldn't read. "He hasn't let anyone into this home since his wife died," Margot said, her voice low and even, as if she were stating a truth she had memorized long ago. 3 years. No guests, no friends, no one. Delivery people are only allowed as far as the lobby on the 1st floor. His men meet on the 41st floor. No one sets foot on the 42nd except me. Wren didn't know what to say to that, so she only nodded. Margot stood, then paused at the door. "Don't wander through the house. Don't open closed doors. And don't ask him about his wife." She disappeared into the hallway, and Wren heard her footsteps fade away until there was nothing left. Milo had finished eating, and was curled up on the bed, his eyes closed. Wren pulled the blanket over him, touched his forehead, and found it a little cooler than it had been outside in the rain, maybe because of the hot food, or maybe because, for the first time in weeks, he was lying on a real bed in a warm room. Wren sat down beside the bed, her back against the wall, and suddenly everything came at her all at once. 6 weeks pressed into one moment, 6 weeks in which she hadn't allowed herself to cry, because crying was a luxury people on the run didn't have the right to afford. 6 weeks of swallowing tears every night, because if Milo saw his mother cry, he would be scared, and he had already been scared enough. But now Milo was asleep, and this room was dark, and for the first time in 6 weeks, Wren felt safe enough to fall apart. She cried without making a sound, both hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking without a single noise coming out, the kind of crying done by someone who had learned to cry silently until silence became habit. She cried for Scott, for the apartment she had lost, for the doors that had slammed shut, for her torn shoes, for 2 days without food, for the son who didn't speak, and for the 27-year-old woman sitting on the floor of a mafia boss's penthouse, because there was nowhere else in the world willing to let her in. Then she wiped her face, lay down beside Milo, and fell asleep, without remembering when her eyes closed. Wren woke at 4 o'clock in the morning out of habit. 4 weeks of running had trained her body to wake before dawn, before anyone could find her. The room was pitch black, and Milo was still curled beside her, breathing evenly. Wren lay still for a while, listening to her own heartbeat, trying to remember where she was. Then she heard it. A strange sound, soft and repeating, as if someone were lightly scratching at wood, mixed with a breath she knew didn't belong to a person. Wheezing, broken, weak, the sound came from the far end of the hall. Wren knew Margot had told her not to open closed doors. She knew she was inside the home of the most dangerous man in Boston, and that any mistake could get her thrown out before dawn. But that breathing, that broken, weak wheeze, was something she had heard hundreds of times in her father's clinic in Worcester, and she knew exactly what it meant. Something was dying. She stood and went out into the hallway. The last door on the left wasn't locked, open about 2 fingers wide, and the breathing came from inside. Wren pushed the door open. The room was dark, much warmer than the rest of the penthouse, and in the center of the opposite wall stood a large glass terrarium that took up nearly half the wall, lit from within by a heat lamp, giving off a faint red glow. And inside the terrarium, Coiled in the far corner was a glossy black snake, nearly 2 meters long. Ren recognized it immediately. Black mamba, Dendroaspis polylepis, one of the most venomous snakes in the world. Her father had treated at least 4 of them during his 25 years as a veterinarian, specializing in exotic animals outside Worcester, and Ren had assisted him since she was 12 years old. She had held snakeheads while her father gave injections. She had learned to read their body language before she learned to drive. This snake wasn't coiled properly. It was coiled too tightly, contracting abnormally, its head tucked into its body instead of raised in alertness. Its mouth was slightly open, and Ren saw cloudy mucus stretching in threads between its jaws. Wheezing, fast, shallow. A respiratory infection, maybe 2 days old, maybe longer. And if no one did anything, this snake would be dead before nightfall. Thomas Calloway had taught his daughter many things before he died 2 years ago, and one of them was this: when a living creature is dying, you don't have the right to stand there and watch just because you're afraid. Ren opened the lid of the terrarium. Warm, damp air rushed against her face. She reached both hands inside, one hand supporting the back of the snake's head with the technique her father had taught her, her thumb and index finger holding gently just behind the jawbone, while her other hand lifted the front part of its body. Obsidian reacted weakly, its body shifting, but it didn't have the strength to fight her, and Ren lifted it out of the terrarium, placing it on her lap as she sat down on the floor. The snake wrapped around her arm by instinct, seeking warmth, and Ren felt that its body was colder than normal, colder than a healthy black mamba's body should be. She searched the room and found a small cabinet containing a few basic tools: clean towels, a dropper, and a bottle of saline solution. She raised the temperature of the heat lamp in the terrarium, used a warm, damp towel to wipe the mucus from Obsidian's mouth, then mixed a diluted saline solution and placed it drop by drop into the snake's mouth with the dropper to rinse the airway. Obsidian lay still on her lap, its head resting in her palm, and Ren whispered to it in the low, steady voice her father had once used with every animal he treated, not because snakes understood words, but because an even voice helped them panic less. She worked in the darkness, with only the faint red light from the terrarium, and she didn't know how much time had passed until the light changed. Dawn slipped through the small window above, laying a pale pink stripe across the floor, and Ren looked up when she heard footsteps at the door. Caspian stood in the doorway. He didn't move, didn't speak, only stood there watching her sit on the floor with the black mamba wrapped around her bare arm, the snake's head resting in her palm, and on the shelf behind her was the small photograph in a silver frame she hadn't seen in the dark, a photograph of a woman smiling with the black snake coiled around her wrist. Caspian's face was no longer cold. It was empty. Empty in the way a person looks when something touches a wound they thought had scarred over long ago. "Your snake has a respiratory infection," Ren said, her voice calm, though her heart was beating very fast. "The mucus has been building up for at least 2 days. Without treatment, it'll be dead before tonight. Why do you know how to handle venomous snakes?" Caspian's voice was hoarse, and Ren realized it wasn't the voice of anger, but the voice of someone trying to control something much larger than anger. "My father was a veterinarian. He specialized in exotic animals. 25 years in Worcester. I grew up in his clinic from the time I was 12. This isn't the first time I've handled a black mamba." Caspian looked at her, then at the snake in her hands, then at the photograph on the shelf behind her, and Ren saw his jaw tighten. "I need enrofloxacin," Ren said. "An antibiotic for reptiles, a subcutaneous injection, and I need it fast." "I can get anything," Caspian said. "Then get it fast." Caspian got the enrofloxacin within 4 hours. His private veterinarian was overseas, which was why Obsidian had been lying there dying slowly in the terrarium for 2 days while no one did anything, because no one in the Voss organization knew how to touch a black mamba without getting killed, and no one dared call an outside veterinarian to the penthouse of the most powerful mafia boss in Boston to treat an illegal venomous snake. But Caspian Voss could get anything, and 4 hours after Ren asked for it, a small bottle of antibiotics and a set of specialized reptile syringes were sitting on the table in the snake room. Ren gave Obsidian the first subcutaneous injection in the front third of its body, using exactly the technique her father had taught her, gently lifting the skin to create a small pocket before sliding the needle in at a 45-degree angle. Obsidian jerked faintly but didn't fight, too weak to react, and Ren kept it on her lap for another 10 minutes after the injection, stroking lightly along its body to calm it. Caspian stood in the doorway through the entire process, not speaking, not moving, only watching Ren's hands on Obsidian's body with an expression she couldn't read, then left. The first night, Ren slept on the floor of the snake room, her back against the wall, one hand resting on the edge of the terrarium so she could feel whenever Obsidian moved. She checked the snake every 2 hours, wiped away mucus, dripped saline into its mouth, and monitored its breathing. Milo slept quietly in the next room, and Margot occasionally brought Ren coffee at midnight without saying a word, simply setting the cup on the floor beside her and walking away. On the second day, Obsidian was still lying coiled, but there was less mucus, and its breathing was steadier. On the third day, the snake drank water for the first time, its forked tongue touching the bowl Ren had placed inside the terrarium, and Ren nearly cried from relief, though she knew the danger hadn't passed yet. On the fifth day, Obsidian ate again. A small mouse that Travis Holt, one of Caspian's bodyguards, brought in with obvious disgust on his face, but no comment. During those 5 days, Ren slowly came to understand the room where she had been sitting. The photograph in the silver frame on the shelf, which she had only glimpsed in the darkness that first night, was now clear in the daylight. A young woman with brown hair, smiling the wide smile of someone who didn't know fear, and wrapped around her wrist was Obsidian, smaller then but still glossy black, its head raised toward that laughing face, Leah. Ren didn't need anyone to say the name. She understood now. Understood why Caspian kept this snake in a locked room no one was allowed to enter. Understood why he stood in the doorway watching her touch Obsidian with that empty expression. This snake wasn't a pet. It was the last living piece of Leah left inside this house. The last creature in the world that had once been touched by Leah's hands and was still breathing. And if Obsidian died, the final fingerprint of his wife would disappear forever. Ren set the photograph down and never mentioned it to Caspian. While Obsidian recovered, Ren began her second task. On the third day after her arrival, Caspian called her into an office on the 41st floor. A smaller room with no windows, only a desk, a chair, and a computer. "You said you could find every hidden dollar within 72 hours, he said, placing a laptop in front of her. "Prove it." He gave her access to the financial system of the legal side of the Voss empire. A chain of 3 restaurants, 2 nightclubs, a real estate company, and a consulting company that Ren guessed mostly existed on paper. She dug the way her father had once taught her to look inside an animal's body, not at what floated on the surface, but at what hid underneath, what didn't fit, what fell out of rhythm, and she found it. $2.3 million missing over 18 months, money flowing out through a chain of invoices from 4 different vendors, all supposedly providing services to the 2 largest nightclubs in the chain. But when Ren dug deeper, 3 of the 4 vendors didn't exist. Fake addresses, fake tax identification numbers, receiving accounts registered in Delaware, the kind of shell companies anyone could create in 30 minutes with $500. And every fake invoice had been approved by the same man, Drake Shelton, manager of the 2 nightclubs, a man who had served under Caspian for 15 years, a man considered family. Ren presented her findings to Caspian on the 10th night, in his office upstairs. She placed the spreadsheet in front of him, the transaction trail, the names of the ghost companies, the Delaware accounts, and the total amount, accurate down to the last cent. Caspian read in silence. His face didn't change, didn't show anger, didn't show surprise, but his right hand gripped his whiskey glass so tightly that his knuckles went white, and Ren saw the vein at his wrist beating faster than usual. "Drake," he said. Only one word, and he pronounced it as if he were tasting something rotten. The silence stretched for nearly 2 minutes. Ren said nothing, didn't move, only sat there and waited, because she understood that $2.3 million was only a number. But 15 years of betrayal was something else entirely. "Are you sure?" Caspian finally asked. 100%. The trail is clear." Caspian nodded once, set the whiskey glass down and stood. "Go rest," he said, his voice flat. "I'll handle it." Ren didn't ask what handle meant. The next morning, Drake Shelton disappeared from Boston. No one mentioned him again. Not in the penthouse, not on the 41st floor, not anywhere. As if he had never existed. Ren drew a clear line for herself in her mind at that exact moment. She handled numbers, not people, and she didn't ask questions when she didn't want to know the answers. But there was one thing she couldn't ignore. Drake Shelton was a club manager, good at diplomacy, good at keeping customers happy. But the Delaware Shell Company system required financial and legal knowledge he didn't have. Someone had designed that money-siphoning network for Drake. Someone smarter, richer, more powerful, and that someone was still out there. Wren hadn't told Caspian that yet. Not yet, because she needed more proof. But she knew. That night, Caspian knocked on her door. Wren opened it and found him standing in the hallway. No whiskey glass, no cold expression, only one short sentence. "You stay." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. Wren nodded, and Caspian walked away down the dark hallway without looking back. The 41st floor wasn't the penthouse, but it wasn't a place meant for outsiders either. This was the operations floor, where Caspian's men held meetings, where calls were made, where decisions that would never appear on any piece of paper were made behind closed doors. And now, in the far corner of the hallway, inside a small windowless room with one desk and one laptop, a 27-year-old woman was sitting there digging through the books. They didn't like that. Wren knew it from the very first morning. She stepped down onto the 41st floor and felt their eyes sticking into her back like needles. Knox Barrett was the first one to say it outright. The 40-year-old head bodyguard, with a scar running from his left temple down near the corner of his mouth, a body built like an iron cabinet, and eyes that looked at Wren every morning as if she were a stain on the floor someone had forgotten to clean. "The boss doesn't need an accountant," Knox told her on the second day, blocking the hallway with a body twice as wide as hers. "The boss has had a system running for 10 years without anybody sitting around digging into it." Wren stepped to the side and went around Knox without answering. She had learned during 4 weeks on the streets that arguing with someone who didn't want to listen only wasted breath, and breath was not something she had to spare. But Knox wasn't the only one. Wren heard them call her that name when they thought she couldn't hear. The stray cat. And sometimes they didn't even bother lowering their voices. "That stray cat the boss picked up," one of the men said in the security room as Wren walked past. The door opened just wide enough for the sentence to slip out. "Picked her up and put her on the 42nd floor too," another voice answered, and laughter broke out, the kind of knowing laughter men used when they were hinting at something they didn't need to say clearly. Wren stopped for half a step. Blood rushed to her face so hot she could feel every pulse beating at her temples. She knew what they were saying, knew why they thought she was staying on the 42nd floor, and she wanted to push that door open and scream in their faces that she slept in a small room at the end of the lower hallway with her 5-year-old son, and that the closest thing she had ever done to touching Caspian Voss was giving antibiotics to his snake. But she didn't scream. She swallowed it down, kept walking, sat at her desk, opened the laptop, and worked. Because Milo needed her to keep this place, and keeping this place meant swallowing everything and continuing to type. The days on the 41st floor were cold and sharp as a blade, but the 42nd floor was different. Milo had grown used to the penthouse in the way children grow used to any place. Quickly and without question, he explored every corner Margot allowed, sat drawing on the kitchen floor while she cooked, and stood by the glass walls watching airplanes cross the Boston sky. But the place he returned to most often was Obsidian's room. One afternoon when Wren came upstairs after work, she found her room empty. Milo wasn't there, and her heart tightened for one beat before she heard small footsteps at the end of the hall. She followed them and found Milo standing in front of the terrarium, alone, his small hands pressed against the glass. Obsidian had recovered, its glossy black body coiled beneath the heat lamp, and when Milo placed his hand on the glass, the snake moved, slowly, sliding over the sand. It came toward the part of the glass where Milo's hand was resting, then lifted its head and touched its nose to the glass, right at the center of the boy's palm. Milo smiled. Wren stood in the doorway and forgot how to breathe. The boy smiled, a small smile, slightly tilted to the right, just like Scott's, and it was the first time since the night the police knocked on the door to tell him his father was dead that Milo's face had shown anything other than emptiness. Still no words. Not one word, but a smile. And that smile was worth more than every word in the world. Wren didn't know she wasn't the only one who saw it. Caspian stood behind her in the dark hallway, far enough away that she didn't notice him, close enough to see everything. He watched the 5-year-old child place his hand on the glass, and the snake his wife had once held move toward him, touching its head to the place where that little hand rested. And there was no expression on his face that Wren would have been able to read if she had turned around. But if Margot had been there, she would have recognized it, because she had been with him long enough to know what Caspian Voss looked like when something touched the place inside him he had believed was long dead. Caspian said nothing. He turned and walked toward his office as if nothing had happened. But that night, When Wren took Milo to bed and passed Obsidian's room, she realized the door wasn't locked. She checked again, because Caspian always locked this room. Always. That was the rule Margot had given her on the first night. But the door wasn't locked. And it wasn't locked the next day either, or the day after that. Caspian never explained why, and Wren never asked. But from that day on, Obsidian's door was never locked again. 3 weeks after Wren walked into Obsidian Tower, Caspian told her he needed her to come with him to a dinner. It wasn't a question, wasn't an offer, just a short announcement in the afternoon while she was working on the 41st floor. Tonight, Voss and Vine, 8 o'clock. You know the numbers I need to present to the partners, so you're coming. Then he walked away before she could answer, and Wren sat staring at the laptop screen for 30 seconds, trying to understand what had just happened. She had nothing to wear. She owned exactly 2 sets of clothes, both given to her by Margot, both meant for wearing around the house, and neither of them suitable for stepping into a restaurant where Wren guessed one dinner cost more than a month's rent at her old apartment. Margot solved that problem without Wren needing to ask. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she knocked on Wren's door and laid a black dress on the bed. Simple, knee-length, not revealing, not glamorous, but when Wren put it on and stood in front of the mirror, she didn't recognize herself. The woman in the mirror had black hair brushed neatly back, a face that was still thin but no longer as pale as it had been 3 weeks earlier. And the dress fit her in the way expensive clothes always did, turning her from the woman who had come begging for work at midnight into someone she hadn't known she could become. "Don't look too long," Margot said from the doorway. "You'll get used to it." Voss and Vine sat on Newbury Street in Back Bay, the most upscale restaurant in Caspian's business chain, the kind of place where diners booked tables 2 months in advance, and the menu listed no prices, because if you had to ask the price, you shouldn't be there. Caspian brought Wren in through the back entrance to a private room on the 2nd floor, with a long table large enough for 10 people, though tonight there were only 5. Caspian, Wren, Travis Holt, and 2 business partners Wren had never met before. Dinner moved at a rhythm Wren guessed was normal in this world. Whiskey, steak, conversations about real estate and clubs where every word carried 2 meanings, and Wren sat quietly until Caspian asked her about the numbers. She presented them in a calm, precise voice, not one extra word, and the 2 partners looked at her with the kind of surprise men often had when a woman spoke about finance and wasn't wrong. She did well. She knew she did well. And for the first time in 3 weeks, she felt as if she belonged in the chair where she was sitting. Then Colette Ashford walked in. She hadn't been invited. She didn't need to be invited. Colette entered the private room as if she owned it, 34 years old, platinum hair cut to her shoulders, a tight red dress, red high heels, and a smile sharper than any knife Caspian's men carried. Beautiful. Beautiful in a way that made everyone in the room stop talking. Not out of admiration, but out of survival instinct, the same way people stop when they see a snake in their path. "Caspian," Colette said, her smile widening but never reaching her eyes. "I heard you were hosting partners here tonight, so I thought I'd come say hello." Caspian didn't stand. "Colette." One word, flat-voiced. Wren looked between them and felt something thick in the air. A history she didn't know, but could still feel. Colette Ashford, daughter of the Ashford family, one of the oldest mafia bloodlines in Boston, the kind of family whose name appeared on charity wings, and also in FBI files. Wren had heard Margot mention the name once, only in passing, but enough to know that Colette and Caspian had dated before he met Leah, and that after Leah died, Colette had returned to comfort Caspian and been rejected. Colette's gaze slid across the table, past the 2 partners, past Travis, and stopped on Wren. Stopped for a long moment. It swept from head to toe, from her neatly brushed hair to the borrowed black dress, and Wren felt that stare like someone flipping through every page of her file before closing it with a red stamp that said, "Not approved." "And who is this?" Colette asked, her voice soft as silk laid over a blade. "Wren Calloway," Caspian said. "She handles my finances." "Finances?" Colette tilted her head, her smile unchanged. "Interesting. You don't look like an accountant." Wren knew she should stay silent, knew she should nod, give a faint smile, and let the remark pass like every other cutting comment she had swallowed from Knox, from the men, from this entire world over the past 3 weeks. But there was something in Colette's eyes, that refined contempt, wrapped in elegance, that made Wren so tired she no longer had the energy to pretend. "You don't look like someone who cares about accounting," Wren said, her voice calm. her eyes steady. The table went silent. The two partners looked down at their plates. Travis Holt lifted a hand to his mouth, and Wren could clearly see he was trying not to laugh. Colette didn't laugh. The smile on her lips froze for half a second, brief enough for most people to miss, but long enough for Wren to know she had just drawn a line she couldn't take back. "Witty," Colette said at last, her voice still light, though her eyes were not. "I like women with personality." She turned to Caspian, said a few polite lines Wren couldn't quite hear because blood was rushing in her ears, then walked out of the room with the grace of someone who knew exactly what she was leaving to do. Wren knew. From the moment Colette first looked at her, she knew this wasn't the end, but the beginning, and she was right. In the days that followed, the rumors began spreading like fire across oil-slick water. Wren didn't hear them directly, but she felt them in the way everything changed. The men on the 41st floor looked at her longer than before. Knox Barrett stopped saying, "The boss doesn't need an accountant," and replaced it with a look Wren couldn't read but knew wasn't good. And Margot, at breakfast on the Tuesday after that dinner, set coffee in front of Wren and said, her voice gentle but careful, "Colette Ashford is telling everyone that Voss picked up a stray cat and brought her into his penthouse." Wren held the coffee cup and drank slowly. Her hand didn't tremble, even though something inside her was tightening. "What exactly is she saying?" Wren asked. "You don't want to know," Margot said, and Wren knew she was right. 2 weeks after the dinner at Voss and Vine, Caspian told Wren she had to come with him to the annual charity gala at the Four Seasons Boston. Had to was the word he used, not wanted to. And Wren had been here long enough to know that when Caspian Voss said had to, it was a period, not a question mark. Margot lent her another dress, black, longer than the last one, modest but perfectly fitted. And this time, Wren looked at herself in the mirror and no longer felt surprised, because she had begun to get used to the face of the woman looking back at her, thinner than before but no longer pale, her eyes still carrying the shadow of everything she had lost, but now with something harder behind it. The gala was held in the second-floor grand ballroom of the Four Seasons, with crystal chandeliers, banquet tables covered in white cloth, live jazz playing softly in the corner, and about 200 people from 2 different worlds standing mixed together in the same room. The legal upper class, lawyers, doctors, business owners, blended with the underground upper class, the people Wren now knew how to recognize by the way they stood, the way they looked around a room before choosing where to stand, the way their bodyguards stood by the doors and pretended to be hotel staff. Caspian led her through the crowd, and people moved aside before he even reached them. Not out of politeness, but instinct, the same way people clear the road when an ambulance comes through. He introduced her to 2 real estate partners. Wren presented a few numbers, and for the first 15 minutes, she almost forgot what role she was here to play, almost felt as if she belonged. Then Caspian was pulled into the corner of the room by a group of men to talk, and Wren stood alone beside the champagne table. And that was when Colette came. She didn't come alone. Colette arrived with 4 women whose names Wren didn't know, but whose type she recognized. The kind of women whose jewelry cost more than Wren's entire old annual salary. The kind of women born at the top who looked down on everything beneath them with smiles they had been trained to wear since childhood. Colette stopped in front of Wren, champagne in hand, wearing white this time, diamonds at her throat and ears, and that smile, the smile Wren had seen at Voss and Vine, the one that never reached her eyes. "Wren," Colette said, her warmth so false it seemed to cool the air around her. "How nice to see you again. I was just telling my friends about you." Wren felt 4 pairs of eyes sweep over her at once, judging, measuring, reaching a verdict within 2 seconds. "Is that so?" Wren said, keeping her voice calm even though something inside her had begun to tighten. "I was telling them about your wonderful story," Colette continued, turning toward the group of women as if sharing an amusing little anecdote over tea. "Wren comes from Southie. Her husband died recently, very tragic. I hear it was because of gambling debt, and now she lives in Caspian Voss's penthouse. Life changes quickly, doesn't it?" One of the women in the group inhaled softly. Another looked at Wren with the expression people save for car accidents, both curious and disgusted. Wren felt her face heat, but she kept her expression steady, kept the hand holding her champagne glass from shaking, kept her voice from trembling when she said, "I work for him. I handle finances." "Of course," Colette nodded, her lips curving. "It's just interesting, that's all. A girl whose husband died because of gambling, with nothing to her name, suddenly living in the most expensive tower in Boston. You have to understand that from our point of view, your reputation, Colette paused for one beat, took a sip of champagne, isn't worth a penny. The word penny dropped between them like a stone thrown into still water. Wren didn't answer. She looked past Colette's shoulder, toward Caspian standing about 5 meters away, and she knew he had heard because his eyes had shifted toward them, darkening, his jaw tight. He had heard every word, and he said nothing, didn't move, didn't step forward, just stood there, whiskey glass in hand, and did nothing. Colette saw it too. She turned back to Wren, and this time her smile widened, sharper, more merciless. "See?" Colette said, her voice just soft enough that only Wren and the 4 other women could hear. "Even he knows who you are." The sentence wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It simply cut through every layer of armor Wren had built over the past 5 weeks and touched the place she didn't want anyone to touch. The fear that no matter what she did, no matter how many times she proved herself, she would still only be the stray cat Caspian Voss had picked up out of pity, and this whole world knew it except her. Wren set the champagne glass down on the table. Her hand didn't shake. Her face was cold, calm, not one wrinkle of expression, and she turned away without saying another word to Colette, without looking at Caspian, without looking at anyone. She walked through the ballroom with steady steps, her back straight, her head lifted, and no one in that room saw that both her hands were clenched so tightly her nails were digging deep into her palms, deep enough for her to feel the crescent marks pressed into her skin. She stepped into the hallway, turned into a hidden corner where no one was standing, leaned her back against the patterned wallpaper of the 4-star hotel, and breathed. She didn't cry. She didn't cry. She had cried enough on the first night in that small room at the penthouse, and she had sworn she wouldn't cry again because of people who didn't deserve her tears. What she felt now wasn't sadness, wasn't shame, wasn't despair. It was anger. Anger at Colette for words as sharp as knives. Anger at the 4 women for their judging eyes. Anger at this whole world for always finding a way to remind her that she didn't belong here. But above all, anger at Caspian Voss, the man who had stood 5 meters away, heard every word, and chosen silence, angrier than she had ever been in her life. Wren didn't remember how she got back to the penthouse after the gala. She remembered sitting in the car with Travis driving, Caspian in the front seat, silent the whole way back, while she looked out through the window and watched Boston slide past in blurred lights without truly seeing anything at all, because her mind was spinning between anger and exhaustion, and Colette's sentence playing over and over like a broken record. When they reached the penthouse, Caspian stepped out of the elevator and went straight into his office without turning back, without saying a word, and Wren stood there watching the door close behind him and understood more clearly than ever that she was here alone. She checked on Milo. The boy was asleep in the downstairs room, the blanket pulled up to his chin, his face peaceful in the way only children can look peaceful while the world is collapsing around them. She sat beside his bed for 10 minutes, then stood and began packing. 2 o'clock in the morning. The old backpack she had carried from Southie was still under the bed, and Wren pulled it out, opened it, and started putting things inside. Her 2 sets of clothes, Milo's 3 sets, identity papers, and the $3,000 in cash Caspian had paid her for 2 weeks of work. $3,000, more than 60 times the amount she had when she knocked on the door of Obsidian Tower, and now she was stuffing it into the small inner pocket of the backpack, along with the $47 she still had from that first night. Enough to rent a cheap motel room on the outskirts for a few weeks. Enough to buy time to find an ordinary job in an ordinary place, somewhere no one called her a stray cat, and no one looked at her as if she had sold herself for a roof over her head. She was zipping up the backpack when the bedroom door opened. Not Caspian. Margot stood in the doorway in a nightgown and shawl, her silver hair loose instead of pinned tightly as it was during the day, and she looked older, more tired, but her eyes were still sharp. "Where are you going?" Margot asked, looking at the backpack. "Away from here, because of Colette Ashford." It wasn't a question. "Because of him," Wren said, surprised that her voice didn't tremble but came out hard, cold, the kind of hard that only happens when anger has seeped deep enough to freeze into something solid. He stood there, Margot, 5 meters away from me, heard her tear me apart in front of everyone, heard her say my reputation wasn't worth a penny, and he didn't say one word, didn't look at me, didn't step in, just stood there holding his whiskey and pretending I didn't exist. "I know," Margot said. "You know?" Wren looked at her. and for the first time the anger turned toward Margot. "You knew he would do that and you didn't warn me? I didn't know Colette would be there, but I knew he wouldn't protect you in front of a crowd." Margot stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "He's a coward when it comes to feelings. Always has been, since before I knew him." "Then that's his problem, not mine. I'm not obligated to stand there and be humiliated so he doesn't have to face his emotions." Wren slung the backpack over her shoulder. "I'm going to wake Milo and leave." "Sit down," Margot said, her voice not quite a command but carrying a weight Wren couldn't resist, maybe because she was the only person in this tower who had treated her like a human being from the first night. Wren didn't sit, but she stopped. "Do you know who Leah was?" Margot asked. "His wife. She died 3 years ago. I saw her picture in the snake room." "Do you know how she died?" Wren was silent. "Leah Walker, an electrician's daughter from Dorchester," Margot said, her voice slow, as if she were reading from a page she had read too many times. "She met Caspian when she came to repair the electrical system in one of his clubs. She didn't know who he was. When she found out, she didn't run. They married 9 months later. She was the most ordinary person in this abnormal world, and she wasn't afraid of anything." Margot stopped, and Wren saw something change on her face, something she usually kept carefully hidden behind her professional calm. 3 years ago, Caspian and Leah went to dinner at a restaurant on Hanover Street in the North End. Leah was sitting in the car waiting for him because he had gone back inside to get the coat she had forgotten in the restaurant. He was walking out the door when he heard the gunshots. Margot looked down at her own hands, folded in her lap. 2 shots. The bullets were meant for him. The shooter hit the wrong car because he thought Caspian was sitting inside it. When Caspian ran out, Leah was already... She stopped, inhaling. He held her in his arms for 17 minutes before the ambulance arrived. She died in the 3rd minute. The room went silent. Wren stood there, the backpack on her shoulder, and felt the anger in her chest twist into something more complicated, more painful, harder to name. "Since that night, he hasn't let anyone close," Margot said. "Not because he doesn't want to, because he believes anyone close to him will die. Being near him means standing in the line of fire, and he would rather be alone for the rest of his life than watch one more person die because of him." Margot looked straight into Wren's eyes. "Tonight, he wasn't silent because he doesn't care. He was silent because he was afraid. Afraid that if he stepped in to protect you in front of Colette, in front of all those people, then he would be telling the whole world that you mattered to him. And if the whole world knew you mattered to Caspian Voss, you would become a target. Like Leah." Margot stood. "The last time he protected someone, she died. He never forgot that. Not one single day." She walked to the door, stopped on the threshold, and didn't turn back. "I'm not telling you to stay. I'm not telling you to forgive him. I just think you should know the truth before you walk out that door." Margot disappeared into the dark hallway, and Wren stood alone in the small room at the end of the lower level of the 42nd floor penthouse in Obsidian Tower, the backpack on her shoulder, $3,000 in her pocket, her 5-year-old son sleeping deeply on the bed, and the truth about Leah Voss heavy on her chest like a stone. She didn't know what to do. For the first time since Scott died, Wren Calloway truly didn't know what to do. Wren stood in the lobby of the 42nd floor at 2:45 in the morning, the backpack on her shoulder, her old shoes already on her feet, staring at the elevator doors as she tried to decide whether her next move was to press the button or go back to the room and wake Milo. Margot's words were still echoing in her head, about Leah, about the bullet, about the 17 minutes Caspian had spent holding his wife's body in his arms, and Wren hated herself because those words were shaking the decision she had hardened inside her heart for the past 2 hours. She didn't owe Caspian Voss understanding. She didn't owe him compassion. She only owed Milo a better life, and she was trying to figure out whether that life was inside or outside this tower. Then the elevator opened, and Travis Holt stepped out. Wren recognized him immediately, even though she had never spoken to him directly, only knew his face because he was one of the men who often appeared on the 41st floor, 33 years old, short brown hair, and one of the men Wren had once heard calling her a stray cat in the security room. But the man stepping out of the elevator now didn't look like that man. Travis's face was deathly pale. His eyes were red. His hands were shaking so hard he had to grip the side of the elevator as he stepped out. And there was something on his face that Wren recognized instantly, because she had seen it on her own face in the mirror for the past 6 weeks. Pure fear. The kind of fear only parents know when their child is in danger. "Miss Calloway," Travis said, his voice breaking. "Margot said you were still awake. Please, my daughter." He swallowed, and Wren saw his throat tighten. "Penny, 4 years old, fever of 40 degrees. She started convulsing 20 minutes ago, and I don't know what to do." "Take her to the hospital," Wren said, instinct coming first. "I can't." Travis looked down at the floor. "I don't have insurance, and there is an active warrant out for my arrest in this state. If I step foot into a public hospital, the system will flag my papers immediately. The police will be there in minutes, and I'll lose everything. Penny will lose her father." He looked up, and his eyes were wet. "I know what you think of me. I know what I said about you. But Margot said your father was a veterinarian, and that you know medicine. You saved that snake when no one else could even touch it." His voice broke completely. "Please save my daughter." Wren looked at Travis Holt standing in front of her, the man who had once laughed when the men called her a stray cat, the man who had sat in the security room saying filthy things about why she was staying on the 42nd floor, and now he was crying in front of her at 3 o'clock in the morning because his daughter was dying. She looked at the backpack on her shoulder. $3,000 inside. The elevator doors still open behind Travis, and beyond that tower was Boston. Freedom. A life without Colette Ashford and Knox Barrett and all those humiliating words. Wren lowered the backpack to the floor. "Take me to her," she said. Travis's apartment was in Charlestown, on the 3rd floor of an old brick building, where the stairs creaked with every step. Travis drove like a madman for 10 minutes from Back Bay to get there, and when they entered the apartment, Wren heard the crying before she saw anyone. Travis's wife, a brown-haired woman around 30 whose name Wren didn't know, was sitting on the bedroom floor with Penny in her arms. The 4-year-old girl lay limp, her face flushed red, her blonde hair stuck to her forehead with sweat, and her body jerking lightly in waves in a way Wren recognized at once. She knelt beside Penny and placed her hand on the child's forehead, so hot it almost burned her fingers. She checked quickly. Ears, throat, breathing, fast and shallow, with a crackling sound in her chest when she drew a deep breath. An ear infection, possibly spreading. Her father, Thomas Calloway, had handled cases like this dozens of times in the rural outskirts of Worcester, where the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away by car, and people often came to his veterinary clinic when they had no other choice, because Dr. Thomas knew how to bring down a fever, knew how to handle seizures, knew how to keep people alive long enough for an ambulance to arrive. Wren moved on the instincts her father had trained into her since she was 12 years old. She asked for cool water, not cold, clean towels, and began lowering Penny's body temperature by wiping the child down with damp, cool cloths, focusing on the forehead, armpits, and groin, where the major blood vessels ran close to the surface of the skin. She lifted Penny's head higher to keep her airway clear, turned the child onto her side in case she seized again and vomited. She mixed warm water with a little salt and a little sugar, then dripped it into Penny's mouth 1 small spoonful at a time to keep her hydrated. But she needed antibiotics. A fever this high from an ear infection that had spread, and without medicine, everything she was doing was only buying time. She called Caspian, dialed the wrong number twice because her hands were slick with sweat, and on the 3rd try, the call went through. He answered after the first ring. "I'm in Charlestown," Wren said. No greeting, no explanation. "Travis Holt's daughter, 4 years old, fever of 40, ear infection that may have spread. I need liquid amoxicillin, children's dose, as fast as possible." 2 seconds of silence. Then, "Address." She read the address. Caspian hung up. 30 minutes later, he stepped into the small apartment in Charlestown with a small paper bag containing exactly what she needed. He didn't ask why she was there, didn't ask why she hadn't left the way she had planned, didn't look at the backpack Travis had brought from the penthouse and set in the corner of the room. He only handed the medicine bag to Wren and sat down in the chair in the corner, silent, while she gave Penny the antibiotics with a small spoon, 1 drop at a time, patient and exact. Wren sat beside Penny's bed all night. She checked the temperature every 20 minutes, changed the cool towels, gave her water, watched every tiny breath of a 4-year-old child she had never met before tonight. Travis and his wife sat in the corner, helpless, silent, and Caspian sat in the chair across from Wren, saying nothing, doing nothing, simply being there. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the fever broke. Wren felt Penny's forehead cooling beneath her hand like earth after rain, 1 degree at a time, slowly but surely. The little girl's breathing became steadier, the jerking stopped, and she fell into real sleep instead of a fevered haze. Travis's wife cried out loud and clung to her husband's hand. Travis stood, walked to the side of the bed, looked down at his daughter, then turned to Ren. He knelt down, right there on the floor, in front of Caspian, in front of his wife. The 33-year-old man, who had once called her a stray cat, knelt on the worn wooden floor of the Charlestown apartment and said, in a broken voice, "I'm sorry. For everything I said, for everything I thought about you. I'm sorry." Ren looked at him and said nothing, not because she didn't forgive him, but because she was too tired to say anything at all, and because sometimes silence is the most honest answer you can give. Boston dawn in December was gray-pink, cold and thin as a sheet of ice over the Charles River, and Ren watched it through the car window as Travis drove them back to the penthouse. She sat in the back seat, Caspian beside her, and the distance between them on the leather seat was less than half a meter, yet it felt heavier than any distance Ren had ever known. She was so tired her bones hurt, her hands still smelling faintly of the antiseptic Travis's wife had given her to wash with before she left. And in her mind, the image of Penny sleeping peacefully in bed tangled with the image of Colette smiling at the gala, tangled with Margot's voice telling her about the 17 minutes Caspian had spent holding Leah's body. And all of it spun inside her head like a washing machine she couldn't find the button to turn off. "You could have let the child die." Caspian spoke with his eyes straight ahead, his voice low and even. "Travis treated you badly. He called you a stray cat. He said worse things in the security room. No one would have blamed you if you'd refused." "I know," Ren said. "Then why?" Ren stayed silent for a moment, looking at Boston sliding past the window, the old buildings of Charlestown giving way to the glass towers of Back Bay, two worlds only 10 minutes apart by car, yet separated by an entire universe. "Because I'm not that kind of person," she said at last. "She's 4 years old. She didn't call me a stray cat. She didn't do anything wrong, and I had the ability to help. So I helped. It's not more complicated than that." Caspian didn't answer right away. The car turned into Back Bay, and Obsidian Tower appeared at the end of the street, black and tall and cold beneath the early morning sky. "I'm sorry," Caspian said, and Ren turned to look at him because it was the second time she had heard him say those words since she arrived here, and his voice when he said them didn't sound like his voice when he said anything else. It was lower, rougher, as if the words had to pass through something very thick before they could get out. About the gala, about Colette, about standing there and saying nothing. "Why?" Ren asked. Even though she already knew the answer from Margot, she wanted to hear him say it. "Because the last time I protected someone in front of everyone," Caspian said, his eyes still fixed ahead, his jaw tight. "She died 3 meters away from me, in a car, on Hanover Street, and I held her until the ambulance came, but she was cold before they even opened the car door." Silence. Travis drove without turning around, his eyes on the road, but Ren saw his hand tighten around the steering wheel. "I stayed silent at the gala, not because I didn't care," Caspian said. "I stayed silent because I was afraid. Afraid that if I protected you in front of 200 people, I'd be telling all of them that you mattered to me. And if you mattered to me, then you'd become a target, like Leah." "I'm not Leah," Ren said, softly but firmly. "I know. Then you also know that your fear doesn't give you permission to use me as a sacrifice for it." Caspian turned to look at her for the first time since they had gotten into the car, and Ren looked into those pale gray eyes and saw something she had never seen there before. Not the coldness she had grown used to, but something beneath it, tired, wounded, and afraid in the way only people who had lost too much knew how to be afraid. "Fear doesn't care about logic," he said. "I know it's irrational. I know you're not Leah, but knowing something and feeling it are two different things, and I'm still trying to shorten the distance between them." The car stopped in front of Obsidian Tower. Travis turned off the engine but didn't open the door, understanding that this conversation wasn't finished. "I'll stay," Ren said, and she saw Caspian's shoulders lower by a fraction, so slightly it was almost impossible to notice, as if he had been holding his breath without her knowing. "Not because you apologized, not because Margot told me about Leah, because Milo is safe here, and because I haven't finished the work." Caspian looked at her. "What work?" Drake Shelton wasn't smart enough to set up that Delaware shell company system by himself. Someone designed that network for him, someone with financial and legal knowledge, and I haven't found out who yet. So I'm staying until I do. Caspian looked at her for 3 more seconds, then nodded once, opened the car door, and stepped outside. It was the longest conversation they had ever had, and also the first time Ren felt as if she had seen someone behind the black glass of Caspian Voss. Not the Mafia Boss, not the cold man holding a whiskey glass in the penthouse, but a man trying to live with a wound he didn't know how to heal. The days that followed changed in ways Ren hadn't expected. The news that she had saved Penny Holt spread through the organization faster than any rumor Colette Ashford had ever planted. It spread the way true stories always spread, not through whispers, but through glances, through treatment, through small changes someone might miss if they weren't paying attention. Knox Barrett nodded to her in the hallway on the 41st floor one morning, not smiling, not saying anything, only nodding, but it was the first time he had acknowledged her existence with a gesture that didn't carry contempt. Travis Holt became her shadow, not in a threatening way, but in a protective one. He stood outside the door of her office whenever she was on the 41st floor. No one told him to do it. He did it himself. And when a new man tried to call Ren a stray cat in the dining room, Travis stood up, looked him straight in the face, and said, "Shut your mouth," in a voice Ren had never heard him use before. No one called her a stray cat again after that day. And Caspian changed the way he treated her in ways that were subtle but clear. He called her into his office upstairs and said, his voice as calm as if he were talking about the weather, "You're not only handling the books anymore. Starting today, you manage the finances for the entire legal side, restaurants, clubs, real estate. You report directly to me, no one else." Ren looked at him. Unofficial chief financial officer of a mafia empire. Unofficial chief financial officer of an empire trying to become legitimate, Caspian corrected. And Ren wasn't sure whether he was telling the truth or saying something he wanted to believe, but she nodded. Over the following weeks, Caspian began asking her opinion on things beyond finance. Which piece of land in Seaport should he buy? Which partner could be trusted? Should he expand the restaurant chain into New Hampshire? He asked not out of politeness, but because she answered accurately, quickly, and saw corners he missed. "You see what other people miss," he said one evening when she pointed out that a real estate partner was hiding a major debt inside his balance sheet. Ren didn't answer, only nodded. But inside her, something shifted, something she wasn't ready to name, because naming it would mean admitting that she was no longer staying only because of Milo or because of unfinished work. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, nearly 3 months after the night Ren knocked on the door of Obsidian Tower, and she wasn't ready for it, even though she had been waiting for it every single day since Scott died. Ren went up to the 42nd floor after work to find Milo, and his room was empty, the bed neatly made, his drawing book lying open on the table, and her heart tightened for one reflexive beat before she heard a voice at the end of the hallway. Caspian's voice, deep, low, and soft in a way she had never heard him use with anyone, not even her. She walked to Obsidian's room, the door unlocked as it had been every day since Caspian saw Milo place his hand on the glass of the terrarium, and she stopped on the threshold because the sight inside made it impossible for her to take another step. Caspian was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his legs stretched out, and Milo was sitting beside him, so small he almost disappeared next to Caspian's body. Both of them were looking at Obsidian in the terrarium, the glossy black snake sliding slowly along the branch, healthy now, its muscles moving beneath black scales that shone like oil, and Caspian was telling Milo about it. "Obsidian is a black mamba," Caspian said, his voice even and patient in a way Ren had never imagined he could have. "The fastest of all snakes in the world. It can move faster than most people can run, and its venom can kill a person within 20 minutes if they don't get treated." Milo looked at the snake, his eyes wide, focused, unafraid. "Everyone is afraid of it," Caspian continued, and his voice changed slightly, no longer truly talking about the snake, though his eyes were still on the terrarium. "When people see a black mamba, they run. They don't ask what it wants. They don't try to understand what it's thinking. They only see something dangerous, and they run. But the truth is, Obsidian doesn't bite unless it's cornered. It doesn't attack because it likes to. It attacks because it's afraid. Just like people. Silence." Ren stood at the door, not breathing, watching her son sit beside the most dangerous mafia boss in Boston on the floor in front of a snake that could kill them both within half an hour. And the boy looked more peaceful than she had ever seen him since Scott died. Then Milo opened his mouth. Obsidian isn't scary. 3 words. His voice was hoarse, small, trembling a little from not being used for nearly 3 months, like a rusted door being opened for the first time in a very long while. Ren lifted a hand to cover her mouth. Caspian went still. Ren saw his back stiffen, saw his shoulders freeze, and he didn't turn to look at Milo, maybe because he knew that if he turned, the moment would break. The child would realize he had just done something extraordinary and would shrink back into silence like a hermit crab retreating into its shell. So Caspian only sat there, looking at Obsidian, and waited. Like you, Milo said, still in that small, rough voice. And Ren saw Caspian's shoulder jerk once, quick and slight, as if someone had struck him in the chest from the inside. He swallowed, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, but Ren heard the crack beneath it, thin and deep. Yes, Caspian said. Like me. Ren stood in the doorway and cried. Not the kind of crying from the first night, the kind born from despair and exhaustion. This was different. The kind where tears came because something was so beautiful it hurt. Because her son had just spoken for the first time after nearly 3 months of silence, and because the first words he chose to say weren't, "Mom," or "I'm scared," but a sentence saying the black snake that could kill a man wasn't frightening, and neither was the man all of Boston feared. That night, after Milo fell asleep, Caspian asked Ren if she wanted to take a walk. Not an order, not an announcement, but a question. And that was the first time. Travis drove them to the esplanade along the Charles River, then parked at a distance. The headlights turned off, and the two of them walked along the riverbank in the biting February air, the lights of Boston reflected on the black water. They walked in silence for a long while, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled, and then Caspian said, "You want to know about Leah?" It wasn't a question. "Only if you want to tell me," Ren said. "I don't want to, but you deserve to know." He looked out at the river. "She came to repair the electrical system in a club in Seaport. I was sitting at the bar, watching a girl in work gear climb a ladder and pull wires, and when she looked down and caught me watching, she shouted, 'What are you looking at? Go somewhere else and let me work.'" Caspian almost smiled, but the smile never fully formed. "She didn't know who I was. When she found out, she didn't run. She said, 'You're you, not your name.'" She loved Obsidian. She let it wrap around her wrist and sleep with her on the sofa. And I always told her she was insane. But the truth was, I was jealous because the snake trusted her more than it trusted me. He stopped, and Ren saw his jaw tighten. "She died because of me, because she was sitting in my car, outside my restaurant, waiting for me. That bullet was meant for me, and she took it instead." Silence. The river water lapped softly against the stone edge. "Why did you let me stay?" Ren asked, the question she had carried since the first night. Caspian was silent for a long while. "Because you held a snake that could kill you in 20 minutes, and your hands didn't shake. The last time I saw someone do that was Leah." "I'm not Leah." "I know." Caspian turned to look at her, and beneath the dim streetlights along the esplanade, his eyes no longer looked cold gray but held something warmer, darker, like smoke. "You're Ren, and you're terrifying in your own way." "Terrifying? Because you make me want something I swore I'd never want again." Ren looked at him, and the distance between them was shorter now than it had ever been, so short she could feel the warmth of his body in the cold air, so short that if she leaned forward, every boundary would disappear. She didn't lean. He didn't lean. Not yet. But both of them knew that the boundary, the line drawn in invisible ink between boss and employee, between a wounded man and a healing woman, between his past and her present, had been erased, and neither of them could pretend it was still there anymore. Ren found the second trader on a Wednesday night at 11 o'clock, after Milo had fallen asleep, and the penthouse had gone so quiet that she could hear the wind outside the glass walls of the 42nd floor. She had spent 3 weeks tracing the money backward from the Delaware accounts Drake Shelton had used, peeling away each layer of shell companies like the skin of an onion, each layer leading to another, and every layer built with a level of sophistication a nightclub manager could never have had the knowledge to create. The final layer opened at 11:07, when Ren traced the last receiving account to the Cayman Islands, and the owner listed on the registration papers was a company named Ashford Capital Holdings. Ashford. Ren sat staring at the screen for 30 seconds, checked it twice, then checked it a third time, because she knew that once she said this name out loud, everything would change in ways that couldn't be undone. But numbers didn't know how to lie, and the numbers said Colette Ashford had drained $2.3 million from Caspian Voss over 18 months, using Drake Shelton as the puppet operating on the outside while she designed the entire system from within, and the goal wasn't just money. Wren looked at the withdrawal pattern and understood. The rate of extraction had increased each quarter, not out of greed but according to a plan. Someone was trying to weaken Voss finances enough to create an opening, enough to make partners lose faith, enough for the Ashford family to step in and seize Boston territory once Caspian no longer had the resources to hold it. The next morning, Wren placed the entire file on Caspian's desk. Spreadsheets, transaction trails, Cayman Company registration documents, and the name Ashford Capital Holdings, circled in red. Caspian read, slowly, page by page. His face didn't change, didn't twitch, didn't crease. But Wren sat across from him and watched the vein at his temple begin to beat faster, steadier, like a war drum before battle. "Colette," he said. One word, and in that word, Wren heard 20 years of knowing each other, 5 years of dating, 3 years of her pretending to care after Leah died, and 18 months of blatant betrayal, all packed into 2 syllables forced out between clenched teeth. Caspian closed the file, placed both hands on the desk, and stayed silent for almost a full minute. Then he stood. "You did well," he said, his voice so flat it was frightening. "Let me handle the rest." He walked out of the room, and Wren didn't ask what handle meant because she had learned that in this world there were questions whose answers would keep her from sleeping, and she needed sleep because she needed to stay alert, because Milo needed her alert. 3 days later, Colette struck back. Wren didn't know how Colette had found out, maybe through an inside man in the organization, maybe through someone on the 41st floor who was still more loyal to Ashford than to Voss, but the method of retaliation was as clear and precise as a knife point. A white envelope, with no sender's name, appeared at the reception desk of Obsidian Tower in the morning, addressed to Miss Calloway, 42nd floor. Wren received it from the guard when she went downstairs for coffee. Milo was at school, the small private school in Back Bay that Caspian had enrolled him in a month earlier, and Wren opened the envelope alone in her office on the 41st floor. Inside was a single white sheet of paper. On it was Milo's school address, written in black ink, printed letters, accurate down to the street number, and underneath it, 4 words: "Debt is still debt." Wren looked at the paper and felt the blood drain from her face so fast she had to grip the edge of the desk. Pike Grogan. Colette had found Pike and used him, used Scott's $80,000 debt, used the name Wren had tried to forget for the past 3 months, and placed it beside her son's school address like a message saying, "I know where your child is, and I know what scares you." Wren pulled out her phone, her fingers gripping the device so tightly the knuckles turned white, dialing Caspian's number with a cold, absolute precision driven by pure survival instinct. He answered after 2 rings. "Wren, Colette sent me an envelope," Wren said, her voice so calm it surprised even her, because inside, she was collapsing. It had Milo's school address inside, and a message from Pike Grogan. 3 seconds of silence. When Caspian spoke, his voice wasn't cold, wasn't hot, but empty in a way Wren had heard only once before. In the car the morning after the gala, when he told her about Leah. "Stay in the house," he said. "Don't leave the 42nd floor. I'll have someone pick Milo up from school right now. I'll handle it." He hung up. Wren didn't know exactly what happened over the next 6 hours, and she never asked. She knew Caspian went to Beacon Hill, where the Ashford family had an office inside an old brownstone building their family had owned for 3 generations. She knew he brought the file she had prepared, every piece of evidence, every trail, every number. She knew because Travis told Margot, and Margot told her, briefly and without detail, that Caspian placed the file on the desk in front of Colette and said, "You stole $2.3 million from me. You used Pike Grogan to threaten one of mine, and you thought I wouldn't know." She knew Caspian cut every business tie between Voss and Ashford, froze the Cayman account through his lawyers, and banned Colette Ashford from setting foot inside any Voss property in all of Boston. Every restaurant, every club, every building. In this world, that wasn't financial punishment. It was a social sentence. She also knew Pike Grogan disappeared from Boston that same day. Disappeared the way Drake Shelton had disappeared, completely and permanently. And Wren didn't ask how because the line she had drawn inside her head was still there, clear and necessary. She handled numbers, not people. That night, after Milo was safely asleep in his room, Ren sat in Obsidian's room, her back against the wall, watching the black snake coiled peacefully beneath the heat lamp, trying to make her hands stop shaking. She heard footsteps at the door and knew it was Caspian before she looked up. He stood on the threshold, his suit wrinkled, his hair slightly disheveled, his eyes tired but carrying something she hadn't seen before, something lighter, as if a burden had just been set down. "It's done," he said. "Pike will never come near you or Milo again. Neither will Colette." Ren looked at him. "You protected me. This time, yes. Why was this time different?" Caspian stepped into the room, sat down on the floor across from her, his back against the terrarium, and Obsidian inside the glass crawled toward where he sat, as if recognizing a familiar warmth. "Because this time," he said, his voice low and rough, "I was more afraid of losing you than I was of anything else." 1 week after Colette Ashford was cut out of the Voss world, an envelope arrived from Ohio. Not the kind of nameless white envelope sent like the one before, but a yellow postal envelope, stamped, with the sender's name written by hand in the left corner. Caroline Calloway, Dayton, Ohio. Ren received the envelope from Margot early in the morning, sat on the bed in the small room on the lower level of the penthouse, and opened it with hands that no longer shook. Inside was a short letter written in Caroline's careful handwriting and a check. "Ren, I heard from the lawyer that Dad's house in Worcester finally sold. You know the house was out in the country, so it took almost 2 years to find a buyer. After debts and expenses were deducted, this is what was left. It isn't much, but it's yours. I hope you and Milo are okay. Write to me when you can. Love, Caroline." The check was for $15,000. Ren looked at that number and felt its weight not as money, but as possibility. $15,000 was enough to rent a small apartment outside Boston for 6 months, enough for a security deposit, enough to buy basic furniture, enroll Milo in public school, and find an accounting job at an ordinary company where no one called her a stray cat, and no one sent envelopes containing her son's school address. Enough to leave. Enough to start over somewhere she didn't have to wake at 4 o'clock in the morning worrying that Caspian Voss's past would catch up to her. She folded the letter, took the check, and went upstairs. Caspian was sitting in his office, his laptop open but ignored, his eyes turned toward the glass wall where morning Boston spread beneath a bleak winter sky. He looked up when Ren walked in, and she placed the check on the desk in front of him. Caspian looked down, read the amount, read the name Caroline Calloway, then looked back up at Ren. His face held no expression, but Ren had been here long enough to read what hid beneath that blankness, and she saw his jaw tighten for half a second before he brought it under control. $15,000, he said. "Money from the sale of my father's house in Worcester. Enough for you to leave. Enough for me to have a choice," Ren corrected. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, her back straight, her eyes steady, because what she was about to say needed to be said from the posture of someone choosing, not someone begging. "I want you to know that I can go. I have money. I have skills. I can rebuild my life somewhere else. And if I stay, it won't be because I have to. It'll be because I choose to." Caspian looked at her, and for the first time, Ren saw something almost like uncertainty on the face of the man all of Boston was afraid to look straight at. "You know what being near me means?" he said, his voice low. "It means the underworld. It means danger never fully goes away. It means there will be other Colettes, other Pikes, other envelopes. I know. And you still choose to stay?" Ren thought about Scott, about the small apartment in Southie, about the ordinary life she had believed was safe until it burst into flames in her face, about the $80,000 in gambling debt hidden in drawers, and the bullet that normality had fired into her life. "I don't need normal," she said. "Normal killed Scott. Normal was my husband hiding the fact that he was drowning because he thought if he pretended everything was fine, everything would be fine. I don't need normal. I need safe." And as irrational as this sounds, she stopped and swallowed, because the next part was harder to say than she had expected. "I feel safest beside the most dangerous man in Boston, because at least you never hide from me who you are." Caspian stood. Slowly, as if he were weighing every movement, he walked around the desk and stopped in front of Ren, close, closer than ever, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look into his eyes, and at that distance, she saw the small scar along the bridge of his nose that she had never noticed before, saw the tired lines around his eyes, saw that those pale gray eyes were no longer cold, but were looking at her with something she had once seen in Scott's eyes during the early years, before everything broke, only stronger, deeper, more frightening because it came from a man who had lost everything and still chose to open the door again, the door he had sworn he would never open. He kissed her. Not gently, not cautiously, not the kind of first kiss in movies where everything is perfect. Strong, clumsy, hungry in the way of a man who hadn't touched anyone in 3 years and had forgotten how to do it but hadn't forgotten the feeling of wanting. Ren kissed him back, and she was clumsy too. She had forgotten too. She was afraid too. But she kissed him back because this was real, and she was too tired of things that were not. When they drew apart, his forehead rested against hers, their breaths mixing, and Caspian said very softly, "I won't hide anything from you. I know." The next morning, for the first time since Ren had come to Obsidian Tower, all 3 of them sat down to breakfast together in the penthouse kitchen. Margot made pancakes and added blueberry sauce because she said, "I made too much," even though everyone knew she had made exactly the right amount, and had added the blueberry sauce because last week she had seen Milo eat blueberries at the kitchen table and smile, and Margot Pierce would deny until death that she remembered it. Caspian sat at the head of the table, black coffee, no sugar, and Ren sat beside Milo, who was eating pancakes with his hands because he had forgotten to use his fork, and Ren didn't correct him, because she was too busy looking at her son's face, and feeling something she had thought she had lost forever. Then Milo looked up, looked at Caspian, and said, "Caspian, can I see Obsidian after breakfast?" Another complete sentence, spoken with a newfound clarity that proved the walls around her son's heart were truly crumbling. The first time he had called Caspian by name. Not Sir, not Mr., but his name, direct and trusting in the way only children dare to trust. Ren saw the hand holding Caspian's coffee cup tremble slightly. So slightly it was almost impossible to notice. But she noticed because she was looking. Because she was always looking. "Yes," Caspian said, his voice calm, perfect, controlled. But he didn't look up from his coffee cup, and Ren knew why. After breakfast, Milo went back to eating his pancakes, smearing blueberry sauce on his chin, and Ren sat at the kitchen table in the 42nd floor penthouse of Obsidian Tower, looking at her son eating and at the man pretending to drink coffee to hide his shaking hands, and understood that family was not the thing she had lost when Scott died. Family was the thing she was building, right here, with pancakes and blueberry sauce and a black snake named Obsidian, and 2 broken men learning how to trust again from the beginning. The following autumn, Boston dressed itself in the bronze gold and deep red of maple leaves along the Charles River, and Ren Calloway stood on the balcony of the 42nd floor penthouse of Obsidian Tower, looking out over the city that had nearly swallowed her whole 1 year earlier, and felt the autumn wind touch her face in a completely different way. No longer cutting cold, no longer hostile, only cool and clean, the kind of wind you feel when you are standing in the place where you belong. On the desk on the 41st floor, the small nameplate bearing her name had been replaced with an official one. Ren Calloway, Chief Financial Officer, Voss Holdings. Not unofficial anymore. She had spent the past 6 months restructuring the entire legal financial side of the Voss empire, closing murky accounts, opening clean business channels, bringing the restaurant chain and real estate holdings into a transparent tax system, and step by step pulling Caspian out of the darkness he had lived in all his life. It wasn't easy work, and it wasn't finished, but it was moving forward, and Ren had learned that moving forward was enough. Milo was 6 years old now, taller, thin, and quick, with brown hair like Scott's, but his smile was like his own, like no one else's. That smile belonged to Milo alone, and Ren loved it more than anything in the world. He spoke normally now, spoke a lot, in fact, asking everything from why rain fell to why Obsidian liked lying in the right corner of the terrarium more than the left. Ren listened to every question as if listening to music, never forgetting that painful season of silence when she had feared her son would lost his voice forever. Every evening after dinner, Milo and Caspian went into Obsidian's room together. It was their ritual. No one else joined unless invited, and Ren respected that because she understood it was how Caspian was building his bond with Milo. Slowly, patiently, through actions rather than promises. Milo checked the terrarium temperature with the thermometer Caspian had bought especially for him, changed the water in the bowl, and wrote in the small notebook Caspian had bound in leather for him the date, the temperature, whether Obsidian had eaten, whether it had shed. A snake health journal, written in the uneven block letters of a 6-year-old child, and Caspian read it every night as seriously as he read a financial report. The 41st floor was different too. Knox Barrett greeted Wren every morning with a formal nod, his gaze no longer holding the sharp edge of suspicion, but a quiet acknowledgement of her fierce competence. She was no longer an outsider in his eyes, but an undeniable asset to the empire. Travis Holt became the one who took Milo to school and picked him up every day. No one assigned him that duty. He claimed it for himself, and every Saturday Travis brought Penny to the penthouse to play with Milo, the two children running through the lower hallway, while Margot pretended to grumble about the noise, but always left 2 plates of cookies ready on the kitchen table. Margot, she was still gruff, still refused to admit she cared, still said, "I'm not doing it out of kindness. I'm doing it because if I don't, I'll have more to clean." But one morning, Wren walked past the kitchen and saw the shelf above the sink, where Leah's photograph in its silver frame still stood as it did every day, and beside it, in a smaller wooden frame Wren had never seen before, was a new photograph. Wren, Milo, and Caspian, sitting at the kitchen table during Christmas dinner. Milo grinning with tomato sauce on his nose, Caspian looking at him with an expression he would deny if anyone asked, and Wren looking at both of them with the face of someone who had found something she thought she had lost forever. 2 photographs standing side by side, past and present. Leah and Wren, not replacing, not competing, only existing together. Wren said nothing to Margot about the photograph, and Margot never mentioned it. That evening, Caspian came out onto the balcony and stood behind Wren, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on the top of her head, and they stood there watching Boston sink into an October sunset, the sky turning from orange to purple to black, and the city below beginning to glow as if someone were scattering diamonds across dark velvet. "What are you thinking?" Caspian asked, his voice low, his lips brushing her hair as he spoke. "That 1 year ago I was standing under the awning of a liquor store in Southie, with $47 and a feverish child, and now I'm standing here. Any regrets?" "Regret that I didn't knock on your door sooner." Caspian laughed, a real laugh, low and warm, the kind of laugh she wouldn't have believed he was still capable of making 1 year earlier. Then he turned her around, looked at her face, and said, "You drank orange juice instead of coffee 3 mornings in a row." Wren went still. "And Margot is the worst person in history at hiding pregnancy tests." Wren laughed, then cried, then laughed through the tears, the kind of thing she hadn't known she could do at the same time until this moment. "How did you know?" "Because I know everything that happens in this tower. And because Margot left the pregnancy test in the kitchen trash, without wrapping it in paper." Wren wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at him, the man all of Boston feared, standing in front of her with wet eyes, though he would deny it until death if she ever mentioned it again. "This time, I'll protect," Caspian said, his voice rough, both his hands taking hers. "You, Milo, and the baby, at any cost." "I know," Wren said, and she did know. Inside the penthouse, through the glass of the balcony door, she heard Milo's small laughter coming from Obsidian's room. The 6-year-old boy was sitting in front of the terrarium, writing the snake health journal with a colored pencil. And Obsidian, the glossy black mamba that the whole world feared, the snake that had become a symbol of loss and danger and loneliness, was coiled peacefully behind the glass, its head lifted slightly, turned toward the small hand of the child who was drawing. Wren looked at that scene and understood that this was her whole story held inside one moment. The thing the whole world feared, the thing the whole world looked at and saw only venom and death. A child looked at and saw a friend. A woman looked at and saw a wounded living creature that needed saving. And a man looked at and saw the last piece of an old love slowly becoming the foundation of a new one. Because in the end, the most dangerous thing in the world isn't venom, isn't bullets, isn't power or money or betrayal. The most dangerous thing in the world is the courage to love again after you have lost everything, to open the door you swore you would keep closed forever, to believe you are worthy of happiness even after the world has told you otherwise. Wren Calloway came to Boston like a stray cat, with $47, a child who didn't speak, and a broken heart. She stayed as a woman who built her own empire with intelligence, compassion, and a resilience that refused to fall, not because someone saved her, but because she saved herself. And along the way, she saved a snake, a stranger's child, and a man who had forgotten how to live. This story is for anyone standing beneath an awning on a rainy night and thinking they have run out of choices. You haven't. You just haven't found the next door yet. If this story touched your heart in any way, please hit the like button so we know you were here and you were listening. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it today, because sometimes a story arriving at the right moment can change the way someone sees tomorrow. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now, so every day you have a new story waiting for you. We would love to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever lived through a moment when you thought you had reached the end of the road, only to find another way forward? Write it in the comments and share with us what you feel deep in your heart, because every line you leave isn't just a comment, but a connection between people searching for hope in the same world. Thank you for staying here until the very last minute. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every passing day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.